Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks, dear colleagues, dear friends. Thanks for being with us today. In my view, we have to discuss the most important issue, strategically speaking, about our security in 40 minutes. So I think we can do it. At least we can try. We just came out with Barbora from another panel on NATO's 75th anniversary. So I will start with Karl, given his experience and service in high-level positions in the US administration. So we have a war in Ukraine. So we have the West, let's say, absorbed by this war, contributing to what we all hope to be the victory for Ukraine. At the same time, what we can call the Southeast Asia front is not lively, but it's still working. And I'm wondering if it is working against our strategic interests and what we should do about that.
Thank you very much. Thank the Delphi Economic Forum for the invitation to be here. It's great to be back on the stage with you, from our NATO days together in Brussels. If I could just give an American quick perspective of why the Indo-Pacific region or the Asia-Pacific region is very important to the transatlantic community, to NATO in particular. So 5 points to make up front. And the first is the economic imperatives. That, as I said on another panel, that by the year 2030, we're looking at about 58% of the world's GDP is coming from Asia, and about 14% at that point will be Europe. If you look at research and development, at that point in time, we're looking at maybe 38% of the world's research and development coming from Asia, about 27% the United States, about 22% from Europe. So the economic imperative is there. Add to that, that when you look especially at China, but more broadly in Asia, the production base that's there, the innovation that's taking place, Europe and the United States, we can't be absent from Asia. But at the same time, the final economic point is that we are going through a period right now where the trends are for this so-called decoupling, with China building fences around itself. So for the Euro-Atlantic community to try to find ways to stay engaged in Asia, you can't afford to be absent from China. And then there's a lot of other resources as well. The second point would be coming more to the hard security, that if we look at hotspots in the world, of course, our attention right now is on Russia, Ukraine. It's on the war between Israel and Hamas. But going back to the Indo-Pacific region, we have the Taiwan problem. We've got the East China Sea, the South China Sea, we have the Korean Peninsula, we have the Sino-Indian frontier. All of those hotspots right now, they draw in the top 3 nuclear powers in different ways. The third point is with regard to values and to the question of norms. And we'll come on to this, I know, during the discussion you led with Russia, Ukraine. But we have to look at the world as a whole in the transatlantic community. The fourth would be the breakdown that we're seeing right now of global institutions, and to a degree that can't replace but can at least mitigate this idea of mini-laterals, something I know that I've learned a lot from you, Gorana, in reading your writings, and I know that you'll probably talk about AUKUS as an example, the formal agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And then the final point would be with regard to the defense industrial base. Back to Russia, Ukraine, as we have like-minded countries that are trying to assist Ukraine right now, we're looking at this globally in terms of how to help them. But if we look at other challenges, Russia, NATO, if we look at problems right now, as I talked about in the Asia-Pacific region, this idea of having a defense industrial base that is shared, has the same standards, and can mobilize to help others.
Thank you, Karl. I will come back to you when we are going to discuss how we can better cooperate with this part of the world. But I would like to ask Gorana now. I mean, there's no doubt that, the main strategic challenge for what we call the political West is the competition with China. We are not talking about, we are talking about antagonism, we are talking about competition, we are not talking about threat for the time being. But the political West is rather divided. I mean, you have US having as #1 priority the competition with China. In Europe, the landscape, the European landscape, is very diversified when it comes to China because of the commercial ties. And the Southeast Asian countries are not keen, for the time being, to go to institutional architecture with our Euro-Atlantic institution. So how we can tackle these issues, in your view?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it could prompt, a whole doctoral dissertation in terms of the cohesion of alliances and sort of how different countries identify what their strategic threats or challenges are. I think that what I would underline is that we are at a moment when there's certainly a lot of agreement in terms of what you said yourself, that China is this long-term pacing challenge, in the words of the US national security strategy. But, if you look all across Europe in the major strategic documents, whether these are national security strategies or defense reviews, where China is recognized in similar sort of terms. Now, the extent to which now this competition is going to be managed, or sort of the way that different countries are going to navigate it, that's obviously up to those states. But I think the baseline, where there is a lot more similarity in the diagnosis of what challenges are, is a good starting point, right? We weren't there necessarily a decade or so ago. You're absolutely right that Europeans find themselves in a different sort of position where a lot of trust had been placed in the kind of continuation of business as usual, the kind of, trading will bring change and peace and so on. I think that paradigm has been replaced, right? We do talk about de-risking. We've heard the decoupling even, right? So now, how the two sides of the Atlantic learn from each other in terms of that sort of language of managing China. But I think more broadly, and to kind of connect to the title of this panel, the fact that we do see the pressure to actually come up with Indo-Pacific strategies on part of European states is already quite a significant change that we've seen only recently over the past half a decade or so. And there is a varied sort of kind of debate and different schools of thought whether Europeans should stay closer to home and actually just mind what's happening really on the eastern flank here, or there is a case to be made for why they need to look further way outside of this theater and of this geographical, geopolitical area. I think that, to use again some of the words that US Defense Secretary used, that I think that Europeans are capable of chewing the gum and walking at the same time. And I think where actually some of the efforts could be combined are not necessarily on the military front, but really in terms of the economic coordination and in terms of the sort of normative coordination that we've actually seen more and more about. And just as one maybe final kind of side example on that, I think European Union is an example of how this kind of changing actorness of it as an entity into a more geopolitical actor is proving useful. For instance, in the context of Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, for instance, where there is a lot more discussion these days about how the two sides of the Atlantic can actually harmonize and coordinate their response to China, semiconductors, right, export controls and similar.
Barbora, since the global partners is in your portfolio at NATO, global partners is a rather generic notion. Certainly, I mean, the focus is on Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan. We have not yet discussed in the alliance the idea of a formal structure, including these countries, for a double reason, I would say. First, because not all the allies would be keen to go to a formal alliance with this country, but also these countries are not keen to have a formal alliance because they prefer this kind of informal cooperation, strong but informal. So how you see the future of this partnership evolving? Maybe, I don't know, the July summit will give an impetus to this cooperation.
Yeah, sure, thank you very much. Yeah, so from NATO's perspective, we cooperate closely with our 4 partners in the Indo-Pacific to make it easier for us in the bureaucratic term. We refer to them as our IP4, but that's really just a bureaucratic term to make it easier. And they are former partners. Because we also have other countries in the region with whom we don't have a formalized partnership, but we do see the merit of talking to each other and exchanging information and best practices, like, for example, Singapore and others. So the 4 countries that you mentioned are in a former partnership with NATO. We approach them both bilaterally in terms of a bilateral cooperation between, let's say, Japan and NATO, Australia and NATO. And for that, we have very specific frameworks of agreement between each other where we define jointly what are the areas of interest and cooperation that we wish to look at. But we also look at these 4 partners as a block, if I can put it this way. And for them, we have created about 3 years ago something which is called an agenda for tackling shared security challenges. And here we look at a number of issues from maritime security, cyber, hybrid, strategic communication disinformation, but also we're looking jointly at the rise of emerging disruptive technologies, impact of security on climate change. So there's a number of areas that we have jointly identified where we see the merit of cooperating, sharing best practices. Having said that, I think it's a very important point to make and distinction to make is that our cooperation with these 4 countries is about NATO working with the Indo-Pacific partners, not NATO working in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think this is a very important discussion. NATO is not going anywhere out of its border. We are a regional organization. Our, to use the military term, our AOR, so area of operation, is in the North Atlantic. So Euro-Atlantic area, this is our home, this is where we are, and this is where we are staying. But as was already mentioned by my fellow panelists, the implications of any security changes and the geopolitical tectonic shifts which are happening on the other side of the globe do have a direct impact on our security, and this is exactly what we have specified in our strategic concept at NATO 2 years ago, which is, let's say, our kind of main doctrinal document. So there is, I think, a very clear reason why NATO has this cooperation with these countries. We also wish to find new interlocutors in the region with whom we can also expand our cooperation. But to be very clear, NATO remains a regional alliance. And whatever other forms of security alliances and alignments and security frameworks the countries in the Indo-Pacific choose to have, that's absolutely up to them then.
Karl, with your vast political military experience, you serve in high positions in the US military, you were ambassador in Afghanistan. I have a question that it tortured me a bit. I mean, do we Westerners give ground to China with these unsuccessful wars in the region? China developed at the time that we were absorbed by the conflicts? My first question. Second question, with China, we need deterrence and dialogue, and how this can work. What is the mix to use?
Yeah, for the rise of China over the past several decades has been a fundamental strategic challenge for the United States, but I would say for the entire world. And the point about NATO staying within the region is well taken. I remember at the height of the Cold War, that showing my age, there was this poster of the Red Army on a May Day parade going through the square there in Moscow, and the poster was, "The Soviet Union, come visit us before we visit you." The fact is that with China right now, China is visiting the world. It's visiting the world in the Russia-Ukraine war with the support that it is giving for Russia. We talk about our own support for Ukraine. Is it enough? No, China's not transferring weapons, but the economic support is fundamental to Putin's ability to sustain this campaign. If we look in the information domain, we're under attack right now. All of us are under attack by Russia. And China is getting into the game, certainly I can say, with regard to the United States. So are there shared interests there as well about things that we can be talking about, whether it's in information warfare and trying to counter it? Are there things that we can be talking about in terms of our interoperability between our military? Intelligence sharing. Because if we think that China's one theater and Russia's another theater, I think that's a mistaken notion. Standardization, and on we go. But to the question then about China and with regard to NATO, with regard to Europe, the strategic interests are clear. The need to be nuanced, though, understanding that NATO capitals have very different views. We go back to about a year ago, there was a talk about establishing a NATO office in Tokyo until President Macron said that he didn't think that was a good idea. So we have to ensure NATO's lockstep, Europe's lockstep is in lockstep with this. And then the point that we've made about the Asian countries themselves having various interests. What they like, though, is the idea of having, now we call it the Indo-Pacific Four, the grouping with very different interests within that grouping, very different domestic politics, so they can't move forward all as one. But the grouping does provide them a level of cover when you're living in the shadow of China.
Yeah, thanks. Gorana, how would you prioritize, our priorities strategically? How would you prioritize towards this region?
So from a European perspective,
yeah.
Well, I think that there is a recognition on part of all European countries that have aspirations that are more global, and I would say that increasingly, just by the virtue of the fact that European Union is as big as it is, that NATO now basically more or less covers the territory, that there is a sense that you need to identify who those like-minded partners are, and in that context, the sort of collaboration that we see and security cooperation between NATO member states, IP4, is a one instance, right? What I think that we've seen on part of the larger European states is a couple of different things in terms of selecting their potential partners in the Indo-Pacific. A lot of what we've seen recently in terms of these sort of nodes and vectors of cooperation have been actually to respond to the fact that the European industrial defense base is not able to produce all the ammunition or the weaponry that Europeans need. So just as an example, for instance, some of the biggest deals that have been struck in, say, Australian arms production or South Korean have been with European states, right? Australia, Germany, South Korea, Poland, for instance. Beyond that, I think that there is also a political dimension, economic one that has been, percolating for quite some time. But I think politically, what's been quite interesting are these increased cooperation sort of modes and relationships that have come out as a response to Russia's war in Ukraine, for instance. So on that sort of as an example, we see some of the smaller European states, Lithuania, for instance, forging partnership with Taiwan, or, for instance, in response to what is now recognized as the sort of acute issue I mentioned before already, questions of chips, of semiconductors, where particular countries in Europe are forging these alliances that are responding to those issues, Netherlands and South Korea, for instance. So you get that kind of idea, but I would also say what we see beyond the bilaterals is really the resurgence of minilaterals in the region, and those ones mostly, again, speak to the security cooperation, AUKUS we already heard, right, which has elements of kind of the three kind of regions, if you wish, but we see the program that UK, Italy, and Japan are involved in basically making their joint fighter jet, or for instance, France, India, and UAE, right? And there are partners in the Blue Pacific that has a security dimension. The list goes on and on, right? There is really this sort of sense that more recently, these minilateral modes of cooperation are an easier way for states to actually partner up with like-minded countries. They don't necessarily need to be like-minded regimes, right, regime type. We're not talking about just democracies, right, but more often than not, yes, but countries that clearly are like-minded when it comes to who they identify are their security challenges as well. And here we basically see that. Yeah. So in terms of prioritization, I would say, again, to kind of come to the drawing board to basically see who are those that are similarly worried about China that is growing more militarily capable, more assertive, right? But not just that, those who actually see the value to cooperate on matters that are more in this sort of basket of emerging security challenges, whether it's cyber or climate or anything in between and in that mix.
Barbora, coming back to you, and in regards to the institutional framework, if we are talking about Indo-Pacific. So my first question, what about India and NATO? I know that there is a rapprochement, let's say, but still not a formal relationship. And second, if I remember well, there was a kind of political dialogue between NATO and China, not very frequent, but still existing. So where we stand with these two, let's say, big poles of this region?
Sure. So perhaps I'll start with India first. So when I mentioned that we have some partners, former partners, and I usually call them partners with a capital P, just to sort of make it a bit more distinguishable. And then we have countries with whom we don't have a formal partnership. There are countries that we consider, however, of importance, the importance to engage in some form of a dialogue, whether it's a political dialogue, whether it's perhaps looking at forms of some practical cooperation, or whether it's simply by trying to engage on different levels. And India would fit right in here. We have started a very low-level public diplomacy track with our Indian friends about two years ago. But even before that, our Secretary General addressed online, because it was COVID, one of the biggest conferences in India. It was the first time that we had that level engaging. I opened the invitation of our Indian host. So, but of course, we are mindful of the political sensitivities and sensibilities of each of the countries we reach out to. But we consider that talking to our Indian colleagues, such as from perspective of NATO, but so are the colleagues from the EU, so are the colleagues from the United States, so we also our Australian colleagues. So, you know, as Gorana says, we need to look at the map and the globe and consider, okay, who is there we can you know, work with and who shares our views. On China, that's a very specific topic. We do have a common position at NATO based on the consensus of our leaders, which has been enshrined in our strategic concept in 2022. This is the first time when NATO officially declared a common position towards the PRC, where we don't consider China as an adversary, but its coercive policies and behaviors do pose a challenge to our allies in terms of security and other interests. But at the same time, as you said, we do have engagement with our Chinese counterparts. They are both on the political level, but also we have, for example, military-to-military staff talks, more on the, let's say, mid-range level, so not the top, but the sort of working level. And in fact, our colleagues from the International Military Staff of NATO went to Beijing, I think about 3 or 4 weeks ago, for a meeting. So there is obviously some communication happening. And we want to make clear to our Chinese counterparts what are our concerns, and we convey them very clearly on behalf of the allies, but we also are open to cooperation and discussion in the areas where we see a possible mutual interest, such as arms control or impact of climate change on security and others. So it's an ongoing process, let's say.
Karl, let's come to the most, let's say, crucial question of the coming months. That you may anticipate, of course. US stance towards NATO and European allies. I mean, US, and this is a bipartisan approach, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, would like to focus on Asia, independently of who is the tenant of the White House. But especially if we have a change in the administration, we may have a change of attitude towards European allies. But this, perspectively, can lead to a better division of labor between US and European allies. Maybe this will be the way forward for NATO to accommodate, let's say, US priorities.
So yesterday, I had an opportunity to go to the Apollo Sanctuary. And I asked the question for today's panel, should we talk about the 2024 US election? And the answer came back, no, we should not. But since you've raised it, a couple of points is that we may well have a different administration next January. We don't know. Even if we look at the last administration, though, if you look at the rhetoric and then the results, you do have a difference there. So there was a lot of rhetoric about Europe needing to increase its defense expenditures. That rhetoric, in very different ways, have been said for decades out of Washington, D.C. And the fact is that not because of that rhetoric, I think because of Mr. Putin's aggression against Ukraine, that spending has come up. You actually saw during that last administration that there was more aid, military aid, lethal aid being given to Ukraine during that period. That said, there's great uncertainty around the world. There's great uncertainty within the United States. My own sense is, not informed by a deep understanding of our politics, is that the Euro-Atlantic tie remains embedded within our strategic DNA, and that, yes, we might have a more transactional approach towards the alliance, but I can't see the United States under any president stepping back from Europe and, very frankly, stepping back from Ukraine.
Yeah. But an additional comment, if I may. How would you see the best approach towards China? Containment, deterrence, and how can we achieve that?
My view is that this administration that we have has actually managed things quite well. Some have said it's the predecessor strategy plus alliances mixed in. And I think that the balance that we have right now between very explicit that this is going to be a long-term competitive relationship, but one in which we have to be agile, we know where red lines are, and to avoid missteps by either side that could take us on the path to war. I think that is possible. At the same time, a recognition that there's many problems that exist in the world, climate change as an example, perhaps AI. There's emerging problems in the world, which is a recognition in all capitals, to include in Brussels, that no nation can go it alone. And we may be also in a period of time right now getting back to the United States and China, where both capitals understand that they have an array of domestic issues that have to be attended to. There's an array of economic, social, and political issues in both countries. So maybe we have a window of time right now where there's going to be, people are going to be a little bit less risk averse, or be more risk averse strategically.
And ladies, since we have 3 minutes left and we are in Greece, how would you approach the Thucydides trap?
Wow. Okay, so again, another question for potential PhD student, master student, to first of all examine whether the Thucydides trap is actually the right way to interpret what happened, right? Like there are different opinions as to how we use this analogy, right? And whether we are drawing the right lessons. What I would maybe add to, without trying to kind of solve it all for the world, I would just say that what's clear is that in terms of long term, there has been a shift in paradigm across the sort of political West, which is how you opened this discussion. And I think that whatever might come out of this competition, and we hope that it stays in the competition on the spectrum from cooperation all the way to conflict, but what we see these days is really a harmony in terms of not just change security policy paradigm into this major power competition, but a change economic security paradigm. And, I recently came back from a decade and a half in Australia, and now even Australia, after the US and Europe being very vocal in adopting industrial policies as the way to manage their economies, Australia has now come up with its own future made in Australia policy. So what's clear to me is that everyone is sort of bracing themselves for a world that's going to be much more competitive, much more blocky, if I may. But the one thing that's not quite resolved is where this sort of blockiness stops, and where, in terms of the management of the great power competition, where do we draw the line? Do we go as far as to actually tie ourselves to kind of isolationist policies that are going to have us not working with our allies, right? So questions of ally shoring versus onshoring loom large, right? And the extent to which we can actually coordinate and see our differences through. So that's going to be a challenge. And then one thing that we didn't have a chance to talk about, the domestic sources of foreign policy, something that, maybe speaks to that question of the elections. Whoever comes in the White House, or whoever, if President Biden remains in the White House, the question is not so much about, just the White House. The question is the size of that mandate and the resources he will have, right? The sort of questions of inter-branch relations. And that's, again, a question that can be applied to this very continent. So I'll leave it there.
Barbora, I would spare what NATO could do if and when US confront China militarily, because we have only 15 seconds left. So I would like to thank all of you. Let's leave it for next discussion, this question. Let's leave it open.
We'll try to figure it out by next year. How about that?
Yeah. So many thanks. I wish we had more time because the discussion was very interesting. Thank you all, and wish we can have a continuation of this discussion on other occasions. Thank you very much, and thank you for participating.